I would like to thank Marty for his continued support for all of the research that I do and the problems that I continue to ask him about. Okay, so can you all hear me? I'm not really sure about the, it's okay, great, thank you. Okay, so multiple personalities at work. Historians of Chinese art have long discussed the ideals of Hermetism as guiding principles that inspire many forms of landscape painting, from the monumental hanging scroll to the scenes in the humbler forms and humbler fans and album leaves. Historical figures and cultural heroes saw a retreat into nature as a place of freedom where one could regain integrity and dignity, a space for independent self-expression. For example, there we are, Tao Yuanming, also known as Tao Qian, 4th to 5th century CE minor official, yet great poet, famously left his government position with its stable salary to pursue working the land, planting beans, and growing glutinous rice for his home brew. The art historian Martin J. Powers has discussed the appeal of Tao Yuanming. Sorry, I lost my place. And the depiction of his renowned poem, Come Again Home. There he is in there, in the Song era. In this 12th century hand scroll, Tao Yuanming is revered as a man of great character who, with defiant self-respect, would not sell himself out to quell hunger pains. This hand scroll, associated with the style of the artist Li Gonglin, interprets the poem Come Again Home with imagery inspired by the narration-like order of the verse. The scenes are inserted within the lines of the poem. In the scroll, Tao is represented squatting in the fields, removed from official obligations, freely tending to his crops with his most important possession, his liberated self. As Powers has demonstrated, the iconography of the scroll displays interpolations that are informed by the concerns of the shi, a term that in the Song era may be understood as intellectuals, including scholars, officials, and educated elite. Men such as the great literatus scholar official Su Shi engaged in debates on the merits of official positions during the tenure of a corrupt or corrupting government. Song intellectuals, inspired by Tao's examples, at times prefer to legitimize private pursuits, self-cultivation, and by extension, Hermetism, over compromising engagement in the official realm. For this presentation, I consider another landscape, a vertical hanging scroll, which incorporates references to the ideals of retreat, of Hermetism, that are also in combination with agricultural labor. In my interpretation, the painting Gukou Chun Gung, or Spring Tilling at the Mouth of the Valley by the Yuan dynasty master Wang Meng, is inspired by sentiments from Tao Yuanming's poetry. The artist drew upon what I identify as the construction of scholar farmers that were formulated by the Song and further elaborated upon in the Yuan era. Spring plowing warrants investigation, given its nuanced treatment of its subject matter, aligned with scholars and farmers, possessing a delight in ambiguity, typical for literati painting. A quick glance at the landscape suggests it may be a representation of a man plowing in the fields, a farmer rendered insignificant in the towering enormity of nature. However, a scholarly robed figure looks on, and his role or labor as observer is unclear to me. I contend Wang Meng's depiction of agrarian labor is specially charged as it creates iconography for scholarly pursuits during the Yuan dynasty, the era of Mongol governments. As the art historian Susan Nelson has argued, the issue of reclusion was highly contentious in the Yuan. During this dynasty, many educated men removed themselves from serving in government as they withdrew into reclusion, remaining loyal to the erstwhile Song imperium. Consequently, notions of Hermetism were conflated with sustained allegiance to the previous era. Arguably, men were not to collude with corrupt governments and would have appeared to have been advancing their positions at the cost of their integrity. In withdrawing from civil service, however, the men of knowledge and talent, in effect, turned their backs on the people and their welfare. Reclusion removed the men from advocating informed policies to benefit the people, a fundamental responsibility that had come to define the labor of the educated elite during the late Tang and Song dynasties. Like those before them, 14th century potential scholar officials, sought to find meaning in their labor, be it in the fields or in the government. They made appeals to Tao Yuanming in part to legitimate private concerns over the demands of public service. I am not suggesting that the choices to serve society or to retreat from it were black and white. On the contrary, I regard Spring Tilling as a painting in the Yuan era that addresses the seemingly irresolvable conundrum that Tao Yuanming embodied. Through a consideration of the 3 probable Yuan era inscriptions on spring plowing, we may regard the painting as articulating an alternative type of scholarly identification with farmers, constructed within the artistic production of the 14th century. As a result, the painting can be interpreted from a multiplicity of perspectives that serve to integrate viewer with those depicted and with those who are alluded to in the inscriptions. In this pictorial space and outside of it, artists, viewers, and historical figures all perform agrarian labor. Today, I introduce the painting and its figures. I move on to the 3 descriptions that most likely date to the Yuan. I start with the artists, and then I conclude with a discussion of the scholarly robed man who watches the plowman. The painting. Okay, spring tilling at the mouth of the valley is undated, and given the quality of the brushwork, scholars have suggested a date of 1365 for it. The art historian Richard Vinograd has suggested simply the 1360s. Executed approximately 250 years after the Tao Yuanming hand scroll of the Song, the hanging scroll takes on a different format, drawing from the grand tradition of monumental landscape painting. With great height, measuring close to 150 centimeters tall, with a width of 37 centimeters, it presents a landscape within a soaring but narrow vertical composition. In short, this is just a wonderful painting with brilliant brush work. The painting includes the depiction of at least 6 people in a mountain setting with modest architectural structures. Starting at the bottom, there we go, of the painting, a servant carries a jug of wine. In the water higher up, so just in the upper corner, we see a man in a simple skiff fishing. Okay. I'm sorry about the quality of the image. It's really hard to get high resolution for these details. Hopefully they're visible. In the flat fields, we see a man with an ox tills the land and is watched by another man with a staff in elegant long robes. So there those 2 are. A tiny figure, so there we are, up there and then up higher, tends to the needle-like seedlings in the fields. Okay, further up, an individual stands in front of a small thatched hall. Moving upward on the path, we meet a man who is walking down from the saddle of the mountains next to a final hut. I know, this is terrible. I'm so sorry. I hope you can see that. And finally, at the top, we have inscriptions, one of which was written by the artist Wang Meng. Indeed, the current title of the painting is derived from the artist's inscription. The poem offers insight into the associations Wang Meng invited viewers to consider. So I discuss his inscription at some length. I also think that the strategies he used in the text informed the painting, or maybe vice versa. I'm going to start with a translation that is offered in the National Palace Museum exhibition catalog for great painters of the Yuan dynasty. So this is not my translation. It reads, Here in the mountains was where of old I studied the classics. At the valley's mouth, I myself plow and plant the fields. I sketch this picture to depict the manner of superior men, but I suspect it is actually the view in front of my grass hut on Yellow Crane Mountain, and it's signed by Wang Meng. The second line, at the valley's mouth, I myself plow and plant the fields, inspired the painting's title and invites viewers to regard the man who is tilling as no one other than Wang Meng personally plowing. In the Chinese would be qin geng. This phrase, qin geng, also is the name of an imperial ceremony from the Zhou classics, in which the emperor plows a field for 3 paces or furrows. This event demonstrates the emperor recognizes the value of farming labor as he inaugurates the farming season. We have a printed image from the Nongshu, or Book of Agriculture, that dates, this book particularly, this version dates to the 16th century. It was originally written in the early 14th century, and it's very obvious it had pictures in it. This print, from the earliest extant known edition, may replicate the iconography of the emperor plowing as depicted in the Yuan. We know that Yuan emperors did not personally perform this ritual, and other court members served as substitutes for the monarchs. Sung emperors, in contrast, had personally plowed. Wang Meng, as we may know, was a descendant of the imperial Zhao family of the Sung dynasty, and he may have been commenting ironically on imperial labor, but we cannot be sure. We can suggest that Wang Meng used this phrase to grant his act of personally plowing a sense of gravitas, suggesting that, like the emperor, he too valued the difficult work of the farmer. Okay, so returning to Wang Meng's poem, the artist also acknowledges that he sketched the painting so we could identify the man in the scholarly robes who watches the plowman as Wang Meng. He envisioned himself personally plowing in order to execute the painting with what may be seen as his own portrait. In the last couplet, Wang Meng transforms the reader's experience of the landscape from a generic view of mountains to a scene that bears direct connection to his vision from his caotong, or grass hut. We, as viewers of the same quote-unquote sketch, now see the landscape through Wang Meng's eyes. We can imagine ourselves standing at his retreat at Yellow Mountain. The painting participates in the portraits of places or property that served as representations of the owners, as Professor Vinograd has discussed. Yuan paintings functioned as artistic products, sites for social engagement and commemoration. As Vinograd has put it, the painting with colophons and inscriptions results in an interweaving of event, painting, an aesthetic or critical response that all took place within the context of a kind of small group interaction. These personal connections to Wang Meng, his retreat, and the landscape in which he envisions it are all the more extraordinary when we consider the claim as translated, I sketched this picture to depict the manner of superior men. Again, I don't think this is a particularly great translation, but I'm really sensitive to the fact that it's very tricky. This line is bracketed between the claim that Wang Meng personally plows and a reference to his very own retreat. As such, this invites a sense of Wang Meng as the subject. However, I think Wang Meng is referring to the superior quality or appearance of the intended recipient of the painting. I sketched this painting to depict your appearance. Wang Meng is suggesting that he started out to paint a respected person's appearance, but ended up depicting his own retreat. In this verse, it would appear that the recipient is regarded as a close friend, perhaps even a blending of the identities of the artist and his revered colleague. Now, so this blending, I believe, is a strategy in which Wang Meng integrates or perhaps shifts personalities. And this is an aspect that will continue within the painting. So 2 more Yuan era. As for the recipient, the authors of the 4 great masters of the Yuan catalog have suggested that Jung Wei Han, who also wrote an inscription on the painting, was most likely the recipient. The National Palace Museum scholars have reasoned that given Wang Meng's poem begins with the phrase Gukou, the mouth of the valley, this term is a reference to Zheng Pu, a reclusive Taoist of renown who lived and plowed fields during the 2nd or 1st century BCE. He dwelt at the mouth of a valley and famously turned down an offer to work for a powerful general. Thereafter, the phrase "guko" was used to describe resolute recluses, especially those with the surname of Jung, as in Zheng Wenqian. All right, I'm not going to suggest we start calling Wenqian guko, though. I'm going to stop short of that. Okay, Jung's Inscription shares some of the themes found in Wang Meng's. As I translate the poem, it reads, "Homes among fields are separated by small bits of green. I go along hidden trails with a hoe on my shoulder when returning home. Why do I not reveal the tassels of grain in my sack? How could I sigh that in this world people who recognize me are few? Misty willows bow down over the plains and the lakes in the countryside. In the wind, sprouted seeds float into the fields in the suburbs and throughout the domain. Just by chance, I have a break from plowing and hoeing near a rocky cliff with kapok trees and their fibers that make coarse clothes." From this poem, we can see that Zhang Weihan, like Wang Meng, claims to engage in manual labor, plowing, and hoeing. He admires natural surroundings. He refers to the types of fibers on cotton trees that poor rural people fashion into clothing. He intimates that he lives reclusively and anonymously among these simple folk. Okay, turning now to the last UN inscription by Wang Yin. He writes, as I have translated, "Entering this painting, my eyes are filled with the scenery of Jingxi, a few thatched huts next to deep green parasol trees. I physically plow, tilling fields of millet that are 2 qings in size. Sitting on a rock while looking at the mountain, wine is drawn." Okay. Again, we encounter familiar themes. The writer appreciates the scenery and also plows in person. However, his reference to the fields of millet 2 qings in size is a direct quote to stories about Tao Yuanming. In the 5th century, Shen Yue included a biography on Tao in his volume in the Liu Song history. And again, the dates are all there. The imperial family name of the Song dynasty was Liu. Okay, Shen writes, "Tao once said to relatives and friends, 'I just wish to sing and play the zither to support my 3-path or reclusive existence. Is this possible?' Someone in charge heard of this and made him the magistrate of Pengze. Once in office, Tao asked his clerks to plant all of the government-owned fields of rice with shu, that is millet, stating, 'This will allow me to have sufficient wine to be drunk all the time, and that is all I want.' His wife and sons pleaded with him to plant jing, a type of rice that's non-glutinous. Consequently, he had 2 qing and 50 mo of land planted with shu, and 50 mo planted with jing. To put these land measures into some context, 1 qing roughly approximates about 10 football fields, just the playing area. Since we're in Go Blue land, I thought I'd point that out. Okay, at any rate, 1 qing equals 100 mo. This means that according to Shen Yue's story, after Tao's family members pleaded with him, he allowed 1/6 of the fields available to him to be planted with rice for the table. So the other 5/6 were for his drinking behavior. Following earlier precedents, so let me return to this. Following earlier precedents for Wang Meng's poems, I have mistakenly translated shu as millet, when instead it is a type of glutinous rice that is used to produce wine. As this story about Tao's love of shu suggests, or wine-producing grain, the cultivation of glutinous rice carries associations of sort of frivolous use of land and labor for drunken pleasure. From this commentary written 60 years after Tao's death, the famous reclusive poet appears to be a bit of a rapscallion, so fond of his wine that he tends to disregard more practical matters, such as putting food on his family's table. So then these 3 inscriptions on the painting, in my interpretation, all celebrate claims that the authors, educated scholarly men, personally worked in the fields in emulation or in reverence to Tao Yuanming. The phenomenon of scholars pursuing agrarian labor was noticed in the Yuan era and commented on by Dai Biaoyuan, the author of the preface to the Book of Agriculture. So that was the image we saw earlier. He wrote a preface to that book of the Nongshu. In his preface, he took a rather dim view of such behavior and wrote, "In society, Confucian scholars are often mocked for their pedantry. They would rather retreat to farm in rural lands than have regrets for their acts. I often dissuade and denounce such behavior. If Confucian scholars could function with sincerity, then all the people would work and agriculture would be run by farmers. Confucian scholars need not be aloof, personally helping with the plow, pushing its handle to show their worthiness." In the Book of Agriculture, then, a text whose targeted audience was officials who were serving in the agrarian hinterlands, Dai expresses frustration with his fellow scholars who removed themselves from proper service to farm. These scholar farmers formed a blending of social categories that left Dai Biaoyuan ambivalent, at least. Here we also have an example. This is Tao Zongyi, and who is a cousin of Wang Meng, and we have other examples of him. It took 10 years to write this Zhuo Ganglu, and he talked about how he wrote it out. The title of it is when he put down his plow, that's the title, and he himself took on a name, a sort of southern village, so that's his special name. All right. With or without Dai's approval, Wang Meng appreciated Tao Yuanming, and he also valued men who, in his community of acquaintances, followed Tao's example. Turning to discuss the identity of the figure who dons scholarly robes in the painting, this guy with bamboo staff in hand watches the man plowing. For those of us familiar with another one of Marty's favorite paintings, we might be reminded of one of the representations of Su Shi in Chao Zhong Chang's Second Ode to the Red Cliff. Okay. As we may recall, Su Shi was instrumental in the further consolidation of Tao Yuanming's reputation in the Song. Su Shi wrote, "Though most take no delight in farmers, I alone will roam together with them." This particular robe and the crinkled bamboo staff are often associated with representations of Su Shi. The painting of Su Shi for the frontispiece of a copy of Su Shi's poems on the Red Cliff. Oops, sorry, that should have been earlier, pardon me. All right, there we go. Executed by Zhao Mengfu, Wang Meng's grandfather, who was also, incidentally, an acquaintance of Dai Biaoyuan, also shows affinity with the person in spring tilling. According to modern historians in the Yuan, Su Shi circulated in portraits at shrines and was a popular character featured in Yuan plays. Could Wang Meng be including a reference to Su Shi in his painting? Well, Su Shi is not the only man of great culture who can be identified with this scholar. Zhao Mengfu also wrote poems about Tao and had painted scenes from Come Again Home. Here we see a painting only attributed to Zhao Mengfu, in which Tao Yuanming looks suspiciously similar to Su Shi in the first scene of Come Again Home. Is this staff merely a stylish literati accoutrement, or does it signify an affiliation with Su Shi? Now, I cannot and I do not identify Wang Meng's figure as a portrait of Su Shi or even Zhao Mengfu. We need to consider that in the Li Gonglin scroll, Tao Yuanming is represented in the majority of the scenes set outdoors with a wrinkled staff. Okay, it's a little hard to see. In 403, Tao Yuanming wrote at least 2 poems on farmers that are particularly suitable to discuss in view of the painting's spring tilling. The first poem in 2 poems in praise of ancient farmers makes an allusion to the old man with the staff, a reference to the story of Zilu. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be going through these images. Here we can see more of the crinkled staff in that particular painting. Okay, so here we are with Zilu, one of Confucius's disciples. So Tao Yuanming writes a poem. He makes a reference to this particular character, Zilu. I'm going to return to Tao's poems, but first I want to address the reference to the staff. And regrettably, this story needs to be explained somewhat. As the Analects record, Zilu was traveling with Confucius, but he had dawdled and strayed behind. He asked an old man with a staff if he knew where his teacher had gone. In erudite verse, the old man eloquently but critically queried about the merits of a teacher who was unable to dirty his hands with manual labor and who also cannot distinguish millet from barley. For this man with the staff, the great sage, is nearly worthless. As the story goes, the man then puts down the staff to weed his fields, and a stunned Zulu, displaying polite manners, remained respectful. The man with the staff rewarded the Zulu with a place to stay that night and a dinner of chicken and millet. The next day, when Zulu caught up with Confucius, he relayed these events to him. Confucius proclaimed that the man with the staff is a scholarly recluse. Confucius then sent Zulu back to the old man's house, but he was not there. Then Zulu remarks, "To avoid public service is to be without a sense of what is right. Proper relations between elders and juniors cannot be discarded. How then can one discard the rightness that obtains between ruler and minister? To do so is to wish to keep one's hands from getting dirty at the expense of throwing the great social order into chaos. The gentleman takes office in order to do what is right, even though he already knows that the way will not be realized." So in short, here Zulu notes that the man accorded himself properly as an elder or superior to himself as an inferior junior when he rewarded his courteous manners. How then could he not treat the superior, the emperor, with the propriety appropriate for a minister at a lower position? As the scholar Donald Holtzman has discussed, Tao Yuanming has interrogated the lessons of Confucius in many of his poems. And the last three couplets of Tao Yuanming's first poem, and I'm just trying to cut it short here, with the staff, he defensively works out an explanation for Zulu's friend. His mind, Tao Yuanming is identifying with Zulu, and Tao Yuanming's mind becomes detached. He enjoys his seclusion, and he argues that his work as a farmer has merit. So by the second poem in praise of ancient farmers, Tao finds joy laboring in the fields, believing that farming is a worthy occupation. So then, we still have the unanswered question, who is Wang Meng's scholar? Zulu's scholarly reclusive farmer, Tao Yuanming, Su Shi Wang Meng. I think he may be a character type, and this kind of reminds me of what was being talked about yesterday. A character type for the viewers, members of the educated elite who have engaged in agrarian labor. This may be an example in the iconography to portray a scholar farmer, this type of robe with the crinkled staff, in hand. To conclude, I regard spring plowing as a landscape that represents a circuit of deliberations captured in motion on the virtues of Tao Yuanming, his choices, and the options for members of the painting's audience. In view of the Li Gonglin hand scroll, spring plowing reevaluates the personal roles of officials, scholars, and farmers in society and represents them blending together within a monumental yet personal landscape that invites group interaction. In my interpretation, Wang Meng's depiction of his multiple personality farmer or the scholar-farmer type allows for the viewers to identify with Tao Yuanming. Just as Wang Meng plays with the blending of his persona with the recipient and the viewers of the painting, a strategy that I saw earlier in this inscription, Wang Meng also invites scholar recluses who work the land with dignity to appear at his Yellow Mountain retreat and in his painting. They are incorporated within various roles as scholars, as recluse, as farmer, as artist, as inscriber, as viewer. Members of this group can be regarded as enacting Tao's farmer and scholar personas to justify in part their retreat from society's obligations. The painting works to bring together the appearances of worthy scholars as farmers and scholars as recluses, laying them together in a constellation with Tao Yuanming as the community's most illustrious star. Spring tilling at the mouth of the valley serves to reconfigure our understanding of the import of agriculture within Yuan and even Song scholarly identity and labor. Thank you. Yay. The end.
Thank you. Next speaker is graduate student Wang Gewei, and her interest concerns the connection between art and the political institutions, especially the interaction between art and the public policy and how artists negotiate their personal agency.
Okay, thank you so much for Professor Lee and Professor Hammers. Before I give my talk, please allow me a few minutes to thank my advisor. At the very beginning, when I got to know that Professor Powers was going to retire, I was so worried because this is my 5th year in grad school, and it may still take 3 more years to finish. And I wondered, what could I do if Professor Powers retires? And soon later, I felt that actually it may be a good thing. It may speed up my graduation because I don't have to fight for office hours with other undergrads anymore. And so during semesters, I usually go to Professor Powers' office hours every week, and I always learn very much from talking to him. So sometimes, since time is so short, so one trick I used was to keep asking and pretended that I forgot time. Until Professor Powers looked at his watch a few times and finally reminded me, "Gerui, I parked my meter today. I have to go. I will get a ticket." So when I first came to the US for my MA studies at the Center for Chinese Studies, I knew very little about art history. I took a class with Professor Powers, which examined arts and social thoughts that challenges cultural and political norms in early modern China and Europe, very relevant to his new book. I was completely struck by his approach to art and cross-cultural analysis. For the first time, I recognized concepts like equality and freedom of speech had a long tradition in China and had impact on European Enlightenment thinkers. This course made me decide to study art history with him. But the class had a very strange title. It's called Norm and Storm. Once, when I went to Professor Powers' office hour, before I knocked on his door, I noticed this tiny paper attached to the door, which reads, "Discontent is the first step in the progress of a man or a nation." All of a sudden, I understood the essence of the course title. By the way, this note, which now looks like to be from a fortune cookie, is still there. That's a found object in Professor Powers' Art of Teaching. On one social occasion, when people complained about the low pay in academia, Professor Powers said, "Oh, I'm very satisfied that someone is paying me to read song poetry." His favorite poet is the 11th century poet Michelson. In his office, he hands a somewhat tilted printout of a Michelson poem. Yes, it's just a printout. I thought he would at least put someone's calligraphy of it if he really likes it. So in China, when he teaches in China, when some students ask him, "So Professor Powers, what's your favorite poet?" He would say, a poem. He would say Michelson, and he would recite this poem in front of students with faith, especially the last couplet. 男儿自有手，可杀不可苟. So over the years, grad students went on field trips with Professor Powers to museums in China and in the US. So from these photos, we're talking about visual analysis, right? We know that Professor Powers washed his hair very carefully over the years, but probably not his shirt as much. And I almost laughed out this morning when I saw him because he's wearing the exact shirt today. I didn't tell him anything beforehand, by the way. It's just a coincidence. So last but not least, and thank you for Ross bringing us to the world of Taoyuanmin. So we grad students found much in common between Professor Powers and Taoyuanmin and Su Shi. So at least one unequivocal commonality is that they all had a big belly. And by the way, a big belly is a metaphor for a generous and open-minded man. Okay, now it's my boring talk. Chinese round fans can be at least traced back to the 1st century BC, and the practice of writing calligraphy and painting on them had appeared by the 4th century. Song Dynasty records have widely reproduced the story of the famous Jin Dynasty calligrapher Wang Xianzhi writing inscriptions on fans. The anecdote alleged that when Wang Xianzhi was inscribing on a round fan, he made an error in one character, and so he cleverly drew an ox to cover it. Round fans were used for courtly and ceremonial events by palace ladies in Tang times. Although round fans continued to be used in ceremonial events in history, they became increasingly popular on the market during Song times, consumed by men and women of all social strata. Fan shops specializing in fans of different materials and with diverse painting themes filled in urban spaces. Fans adorned with calligraphy and painting were brought to the streets, tea houses, restaurants, parties, and other public spaces. As Dr. Liu Bo has shown, the words and images on fans not only served as ornament responding to increasing commercial and aesthetic demand, but also expressed the social views of the owner, linking the owner to topical issues of the time. Period texts show that painting and calligraphy on fans drew notice in public settings, such that people would talk about them on social occasions. Images of people of all kinds holding fans also appear on multiple artistic media. The large quantities of poems about fans or poems originally inscribed on fans and later circulated in print further extended the life of these personal items among the public. Archaeological findings show that the making of Song Dynasty round fans involved a variety of materials, including paper, bamboo, wood, silk, and lacquer. The round fan unearthed from a scholar official, Huang Huan's tomb, was made of sliced bamboo threads with a lacquered wooden stick and silk covering its surface. Another similarly shaped fan was found in the tomb of a man who had been a student in the National Academy named Zhou Yu. His fan had a paper layer covering the surface of the bamboo frame. The wooden stick was lacquered in black with exquisite carvings. 2 characters, Jun Yu, were carved on the stick, perhaps as an identifying marker of its owner. 2 characters, Jun Yu, may be a marker of Zhou Yu, as Yu means a stone that resembles jade. Another oval-shaped fan discovered from Huang Shen's tomb is made of has a flower painting on the silk layer covering the bamboo frame. The fan almost disintegrated after being unearthed. This type of fan was made of a lacquered wood handle and fine bamboo strips in a manner that is consistent with Song Boren's description of a fan in a poem. 修柄淡夸千缕骨. It means that the already exquisite lacquered handle was augmented with the thousands of delicate threads or bamboo bones. Such type of fan seems to be a popular item among Song scholars. A similar fashion can be seen in the fan used by the scholar depicted in the painting 18 Scholars and Listening to Qin Music. Not all Song Dynasty fans were made with bamboo frames. A Southern Song fan housed in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, was made of silk and paper with a wooden frame and a handle. The silk was attached to a paper backing rather than to the bamboo frame. Another round fan housed in the Museum of Fine Arts is made of kesi, or Chinese silk tapestry, vividly capturing fish roaming through aquatic plants. The design of this fan resonates with contemporary painted fans with similar motif, indicating the close interaction between textile and painting at the time. Both the material and the artistic quality of Song round fans varied extensively so as to cater to wide-ranging market needs. Among extant Song fan paintings, one can distinguish different levels of quality in the use of brush and ink, thoughtfulness of compositions, as well as different types of cultural references, decorative, courtly styles, as opposed to more understated but sophisticated literati themes. For example, in comparison with Zhao Mengjian's depiction of the 3 Friends of the Cold, the Snow Plum fan painting on the right was painted on coarser silk. The brushwork is weak and overly sparing in ink, and the composition is less sophisticated. Sparrows, plums, and bamboo adopted a more decorative style. On the other hand, snow plum adopted the ink monochrome plum tradition that evokes a type of elegant taste that appealed more to the educated. Even fans in the fashion of the bamboo frame were not necessarily consumed exclusively by the cultured scholars in the case of those discovered in the tombs mentioned earlier. Several versions of the knick-knack peddler show that rural dwellers had access to fans of a similar form, although these fans may have used cheaper materials such as palm leaves, mimicking the effect of bamboo threads. It is unlikely, moreover, that it would have a lacquered handle. Round fans penetrated into the daily lives of people of different income levels and for a variety of purposes. Murals from Zhang Gongyou and Zhang Wenzao's tombs depict scenes showing boy attendants using painted fans to control the fire of the stove when preparing water for tea. This use of the fan can be seen in the Song painting 9 Old Men of Huichang. A similar scene appeared in the hand scroll Preparing Silk, where a palace lady uses a fan with painted love ducks in snow to adjust the heat of the charcoal. Female attendants might bring a fan sporting a painting of bamboo to a literati gathering. In another instance, a man keeps a fan decorated with pinkish flower blossom in his belt while playing soccer with friends in the garden. Literati also might bring fans with calligraphic inscriptions to elegant gathering. And a fan with the theme of children playing, the children depicted in the painting, used fans as a prop in their games. The depiction of fans and people using fans appeared across a wide range of artistic media during the Song dynasty, including painting, temple murals, tomb murals, stone carvings, fan painting themselves, and even bronze mirrors. And ceramic pillows. Such a phenomenon reveals the unique place of round fans in the everyday living and cultural practice of people in Song times. Fan shops were an important part of the memory of urban life in the Song dynasty. Meng Liang Lu, a late Southern Song text describing the life of the capital Ling'an, recorded a number of fan shops specializing in assorted types of fans. There were at least 9 fan shops in the city, each with their own market niche, including Xu Mao's family fan shop, Green Comb fan shop, the folding fan shop, shops specializing in silk fans with paintings, paper fans, fans with plum blossom and bamboo designs, Zhang family's fans featuring landscape painting. There was even a fan shop specializing in selling lacquered fan handles. This suggests that the fan-making process itself could involve some kind of division of labor, with different artisans making the bamboo frame, but who might not make the lacquered handle. There was even a merchant of repairing business who could fix a number of things, including broken fans. Judging from the level of specialization in themes for painted fans, we can infer that some motifs such as plum blossoms and bamboo or landscapes enjoyed a sufficiently larger market to justify a shop offering only this type of fans. The large quantities of landscape fan paintings that survive, as well as multiple fans displaying the same landscape motif, is congruent with the literary evidence. While the motifs on these fans were adapted to different markets, no one was required to purchase a painting with any particular theme. What a man or woman could acquire was limited by purchasing power, as it would be today, but the purchase of such fans was a personal choice. People displayed them as personal items reflecting their own tastes and interests. It is intriguing that even fans sold in rural markets, for instance, those shown in the knick-knack peddler paintings, also have words inscribed on them to convey a particular point of view. These paintings were made at court, of course, and might be expected to paint a rosy picture of rural life, but it is unlikely that they would show fans among commercial goods available in the village if contemporaries knew this to be impossible. In these paintings, we find two strips of paper attached to the bamboo fence bearing a couplet. Recent studies by Qin Man and Huang Xiaofeng discovered that the two lines of characters on the fan were from a poem by a late Tang Dynasty poet Feng Dao. So the two couplets on the fan reads, 但知行吼事，莫摇稳前程. On surface, these are not the same with those in Feng Dao's poem and seem to make no sense. However, if these characters are read in Mandarin in the Song dynasty according to their tones recorded in Guangyun, or the official phonetics dictionary of the Song dynasty, or if it is read in modern-day Hangzhou dialect, it will match the poem and make perfect sense. The original couplet reads, 但知行好事，莫要问前程, meaning that you should only focus on doing good things rather than worrying about the future. Feng Dao's poem instructs that no matter if a person is wealthy or poor at the moment, his or her destiny is predetermined. There's no need to complain about temporary sufferings in life. When winter ends, spring will come naturally. Although we do not know if the rural mothers depicted in the painting would purchase such a fan, we can infer that the artist presumed that sayings of this sort would be popular among villagers. Just like other advertisements appended to the peddler's bundle of goods, such as the little flag advertising rice wine from Shandong province, this couplet was designed to appeal to potential buyers and period viewers. It can hardly be accidental that this couplet was attached to the fan rather than to any other products, indicating particularity of the fan as an article well suited to spreading information about an individual's taste to a wider audience. Round fans during the Song period had a particular role play in circulating opinions. Period texts recorded incidents when fans with calligraphy attracted attention from people in tea houses. In the 10th century example, Fan Zhi once used a fan in a tea house. His fan bore an inscribed couplet, "The summer heat will expel corrupt officials, and the cool breeze will bring the old friends." An oddly looking man in the tea house walked over to Fan Zhi, bowed, and spoke to him. The horrible things committed by the corrupt officials was much more despicable than the summer heat. I hope that you could help to remedy this corruption in the future. When Fan Zhi later was appointed to be the minister, he established strict laws to control corruption and established the criminal law, which later became the basis for the criminal law in the Song dynasty. As noted by Liu Bo, this anecdote indicates that fans could reveal the character and thoughts of the fan carrier. Also implied here is the transformative power of a fan, in this case taking away the heat with its cool breeze. Such a transformative ability was compared to a scholar official who could correct the flaws in political system. Further worth noting is that this story circulated in quite a few sources across from 11th to 13th centuries, including personal notes by Shao Bowen and a volume compiled by Zhu Xi titled Records of Speech and Deeds of Famous Song Dynasty Officials, Song Mingchen Yanxing Lu. Since about fans being used in tea houses, streets, and restaurants by people of different occupations appear frequently in Song arts, the 11th century Kaihua Temple and the Jin Dynasty Yanshan Temple mural show not only scholar officials using fans, but also a street vendor tucking a fan in his belt. Spring Festival along the river depicts a man waving a fan while talking to his friends in a multi-story restaurant. For Song period viewers, the images and the words on the fan were far more than just decoration, but were active agents in their life. A Southern Song official, Hu Quan, who was in office of Fujian province, one day got a fan with a painting describing a donkey rider riding to the southwest. This is not a fan that Hu Quan got. This is just a similar painting. with the theme. Prior to this, Hu Quan had sent memorials to the emperor arguing against Minister Qin Hui's peace treaty proposal with the Jin dynasty. Qin, of course, was infuriated. The investigation officer who was in Qin's clique accused Hu Quan, claiming that his act subverted national security and recommended that the government exile Hu Quan to Xinxing in Guangdong province. Upon receiving this message, Hu realized that the fan painting he had just acquired had actually anticipated this exile to the south. Hu therefore composed a poem and inscribed it on the back of the fan. In the poem, he expressed his identification with the traveler in the painting. He heroically stated that his exile to the south was a destiny that had been foreseen by the fan, and he would bravely face the precipitous cliffs along the mountain paths. This poem has survived in Hu Quan's collected works. The entire story circulated in the personal notes of several contemporary authors. The open art market and the rise of professional artists during the Song dynasty led to the rise of genre painting in different formats. Many fan paintings depicted life of the ordinary people and could evoke sympathy from viewers. The boat pullers illustrates the onerous task of workers at river harbors. They had to tow the boat even in fierce wind and rain, as suggested by the flying leaves and dark clouds. The mood in the painting echoes that in a poem by Mei Yao Chen, expressing sympathy for the boat pullers in extreme weather. Educated viewers of such an image were likely to understand the message here, as the intensity of the work and the arduous life of the boat pullers were depicted in several extant Song paintings. Further, a fan could even be a link between the emperor and the populace. The famous Northern Song Grand Minister Wen Yanbo, a friend of Su Shi and Huang Tingjian, once noticed that Emperor Zhezong was using a paper fan at a meeting in court. Wen Yanbo called for all officials present at the meeting to congratulate the emperor. He noted that using a paper fan demonstrated the emperor's economical use of funds. Wen added that an emperor with such virtue would be able to maintain the wealth of the state and bring benefits to the people. This record illustrates that a fan, even a plain fan without decoration, was more than just a self-contained personal item. It was often used with intention and could be perceived by others as making statements about public affairs. In the case of Song Dynasty round fans, the material, the image, and the text could acquire the power to convey meaning and to shape opinions. Thank you.
Thank you. That's even ahead of time. So next speaker is graduate student Olivia Michelson. So her research interest is in material culture of the late imperial China and on Chinese export objects. So her topic will be a pictorial commentary on rural conditions in imperial China.
Good morning. I'm Olivia Michelson, a graduate student in the history of art at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much to JP and to Carol for all you've done to organize this event. Since coming to Michigan, I have had the privilege and pleasure of studying with Marty Powers, and in the spirit of this conference, I have chosen to return to a painting I first encountered 2 years ago in Professor Powers' graduate seminar, and which continues to challenge and to surprise me upon second look. In 1968, Sherman Lee and Weigam Ho reassessed the subject matter of this hand scroll in the Art Institute of Chicago, changing its title from The Laughable Things About the Aborigines of the River Country to Yang Pu Moving His Family. In the Catalog for Art Under the Mongols at the Cleveland Museum, they wrote, quote, "Our present identification of the hero in this narrative scroll as Yang Pu is primarily based on materials found in the miscellaneous writings of some Southern Song scholars. Yang Pu, who is sort of a comic character in Song folklore, is particularly well known for his amusing combination of the kind of stuffy, overcorrect manner of a would-be official and the awkwardness typical of a village scholar. His background was best reflected by the rustic, unkempt appearance of the members of his family. Among the three most celebrated recluses of the early Song period, Yang Pu was the poorest and the only one with a large family. If our thesis is proved to be correct, then the picture is evidently the parting scene at the river, in which Yang Pu is saying farewell to his old neighbors and relatives, highly ceremonial but in bare feet, on his way to the capital Kaifeng, after he had repeatedly declined, but unsuccessfully, the emperor's summons to court duties, hence the official hat and girdle." End quote. Since Weigam He and Sherman Lee presented this interpretation, a number of scholars, including several at this conference, have since contributed their insights and expertise, situating the painting in relation to representations of rustic farmer recluses and in relation to images of refugees. While the Yang Pu thesis has not been proved, it has also not been overturned. Rather than attempt to propose an alternate interpretation for the subject of this painting, I present it as a social site constituted through the interweaving of figures and relationship to the viewer. The older interpretation, which focused on the laughability of ethnically othered figures, and the current one centering on Yang Pu, who derives his comedic persona from the misalignment between social position and behavior, both place the painting within the category of humor. However, I argue that visual analysis of the painting in relation to the sequential looking imposed by the hand scroll format makes it difficult to sustain a purely humorous reading. Humor often operates through the creation of tension followed by its release. Looking at this hand scroll not as one singular composition, but as a series of three overlapping segments from right to left, shows that it instead inverts the order of operations by structuring a movement from comfort to discomfort, and in doing so implicates the viewer in a politics of looking. Of course, one can manipulate a hand scroll in any number of ways, but generally the length of the scroll will exert some influence on the logical viewing process. This painting is 91 inches long. If we assume that most people will open a scroll to roughly half their wingspan and will partially re-roll from the right while proceeding to the left, we may think of this scroll as being viewed in three distinct but overlapping sections: the right half of the painting, the central portion, and the left half. So beginning from the right side, we enter into a densely layered and textured space of trees and people. The child peeking through a break in the tree trunks and gesturing out of sight beyond the bounds of the page introduces the exchange of looks and gestures as a structuring principle of the composition. We next encounter sturdy peasant women and children who bring to mind the opening figural grouping in the Li Song Knickknack Peddler hand scroll in the Palace Museum. In both paintings, a woman holding a baby over her shoulder and with a child tugging at her hem produces a rush of momentum that directs our attention leftward towards the center of action. Four village elders bid goodbye to the figure identified as Yang Pu, who stands below them in the water, with his hat starched but slightly crumpled, his shoes tucked into his belt, and his arms outstretched. Several smaller figures rush to enter the river, and some are seen hauling cargo, presumably the scholar's possessions. In addition to the woman and child who echo the composition of the Knickknack Peddler hand scroll, there are a number of features that situate this work within the legacy of Southern Song figure painting associated with Li Song. There is the rustic theme of life in the country, the energetic line work animating the folds of garments, the transparent washes of color, the extremely fine details of individuated facial features and expressions, and, as noted, the use of lateral directional movements and gestures to maintain pictorial cohesion. In these ways, the painting may also be seen in relation to a work such as Mock Sebastian or The Country Doctor, attributed to Li Tang. Whether made in the 13th century or slightly later, the Chicago scroll may be understood as responding in certain ways to the legacy of Southern Song academic figure painting, and in this context does not look altogether unusual thus far. We can also start to detect the presence of a structural feature that Ellen Johnston Lang identified as an earmark of post-Li Song compositions: the placement of figures in oval arrangements on a receding plane into depth. In this segment, all of the figures on the riverbank form a spacious oval that then merges with the smaller oval formed by the figures in the water to create a horizontally oriented figure 8, with the small scroll-toting figure in a loincloth at the point of intersection. Rather than appearing as a random confusion of bodies, the great number of figures cohere into a controlled, organized flow of movement through the interchange of gestures and looks that generates formal tension as a kind of compositional glue. A number of microtensions accumulate to produce fluid movement that structures this side of the painting. The tension produced by the child pulling on the woman's clothes draws the eye down to the figures preparing to enter the water, one of whom, here, yanks on the cloth around his waist, an outward force that is isometrically opposed by the inward compression of his shoulder blades. These lateral movements are then intercepted by the recession of the riverbank, which ferries our vision up to the central figure, and then through the outstretched arms of the scholar, along his horizontally protruding hat flaps, and down through the gravitational pull of his weighted lower body. Following this downward force, we encounter the straining body of the small figure in the foreground, who throws all his strength into pulling on a thin rope, creating a tensile force that is counterbalanced by the obstinate cauldron full of dishes. Following the sloping shoulders of the two figures to the right, our eyes are moved along by the outreached hands of the central figure, and then follow his gaze upwards to the 4 village elders and 2 children on the riverbank. Here the directional force is reversed through the thrust of their outreached arms and the momentum of the children rushing towards the water, and the circuit of tensile forces can then be retraced in the opposite direction. The accumulation of microtensions produced by the direction of looks and the push-pull of gestures and bodily postures moves the eye through a smooth and continuous figure 8 circuit and brings the many lively figures into cohesive order. Cohesion and order are reinforced by the practically equal balance of space between land and water, and the anchoring effect of the boulders in the lower right. There is a great deal of formal tension in this half of the painting, but it resolves into ease, smoothness, and stability. Within this context of tensions resolved, we can find humor in the exaggerated, melodramatic facial expressions of the village elders and the scholar, and in their shabby dress and undignified postures. Rather than contributing to the naturalism of the depiction, the attention to minute detail in the figures and faces of these men is here deployed to push the expressions and gestures beyond the point of decorum until the figures verge into caricature. Continuing to the central portion of the scroll, another horizontal figure 8 arrangement of figures comes into view, this time framed within the expanse of water and bounded by the receding coastlines. Here, the density of ink and textural interest afforded by the trees and earth in the first section thin out into expanses of largely unpainted paper. Along with the exposure of the painting ground, there is also a multiplication of bare skin. More of the figures in this section are only semi-clothed, and as the opportunities for finding visual interest in the dynamic brushwork of landscape features and fabric folds decrease, attention shifts to exploring the topographies of bodily forms. Much that was already said about the deployment of tensile forces to structure the composition of figures and to move the eye could be repeated about this segment of the painting, but with a couple notable changes. A repetition occurs in the lower segments of the 2 oval groupings, where a figure again can be seen pulling on a rope while attempting to move obstinate cargo. However, the pot of dishes is substituted in this second iteration by an emaciated dog who tucks its tail between its legs and rolls its eyes back in terror towards the figure brandishing a switch. Rather than moving smoothly along this portion of the circuit, the appearance of the dog forces the eye to slow and stutter in its travels. Following the curve of the switch leads to the figure who forms the point of intersection of this figure 8 formation and is also at almost the exact center of the painting, just slightly to the left of where the two sheets of paper are conjoined. And you can see that joint here. This figure assumes a similar bodily posture to the one forming the central node in the preceding section, seen right here, but looks directly out from the pictorial field. The confrontational look of this figure creates another sticking point, where the flow of movements of the figures in the painting and the movement of our eyes in visually consuming them gets caught up and delayed. Notably, it is in this section where the stripping down of paper and flesh, together with the painter's careful rendering of the bulges and creases of laboring bodies, entices us to examine their ungainly forms, that we are suddenly confronted in the act of looking. Furthermore, while only the one central figure directly faces and looks at us, the majority of the figures acknowledge our presence through the orientation of their bodies. There is a hesitation to position figures in full profile, even while walking leftward or turning their heads towards each other. Instead, most figures are shown at a 3/4 view that tacitly incorporates our participation as part of the reconfiguring of the hand scroll as a social site. The dynamic of tensions between figures in the painting now extends to include tension arising between the painting and the viewer, which is sustained and developed in the final section. I have been arguing that there are tensions at play throughout the painting, but that they operate differently as one moves sequentially through the scroll. In the first half, micro-tensions resolve into fluid movements and allow for humorous response to the exaggerated displays of emotion. The central segment mimics the compositional structure of the first, but the insertion of the suffering dog and the outward-looking figure create stoppages in the flow of energy circulating within the painting and trigger self-consciousness on the part of the viewer, as our attention is drawn to the squat, muscular, semi-clothed bodies that populate the middle of the river. We find ourselves abruptly confronted through the central figure's gaze and feel ourselves implicated as onlookers in the scene, which produces tension within the intimate space between the painting and the viewer who manipulates the scroll. The compositional pattern of interlocking oval figural arrangements breaks down in the second half of the painting, and the circulating flow encounters a physical roadblock in the form of the oversized water buffalo with a breastfeeding woman on its back. In addition to losing grasp of the cohesive organization of figures in space, the tensions building in the painting come to a head in the breastfeeding woman. Sitting atop the huge water buffalo and with a vibrantly colored garment loosely draped around her upper body, she is the visual focal point of the left half of the painting. Delicate lines crease the skin around her eyes, the sagging folds of her neck, and the exposed expanse of her chest. Yet despite her wizened appearance, she feeds a child with her wrinkled breast. The woman's physical appearance, so attentively described, does not align with the normative biological understanding of motherhood and the body as a site of nurturance. Similarly unnerving, the child who breastfeeds has the proportions of an adult. A small head with sunken cheeks and long, sinewy limbs, so different from Li Song's plump, large-headed toddlers seen here. The misalignment between the expected behavior and appearance of a scholar official and the image of Yang Pu in the first scene produces a comic effect within the context of small formal tensions that resolve into compositional ease. Here, however, the misalignment between the physical appearance of these figures and their actions causes uneasiness rather than amusement, as the composition does not provide an outlet for the release of tension. The eye cannot flow over and between the figures in this half as easily, as they do not cohere into oval circuits. Instead, it gets stopped up by the confrontational look of the squat man, the starving dog, the ponderous water buffalo, and the woman with child, whose union is itself a site of tension, as the child pushes his rigid arm against the woman's wrist, at the same time as he sucks at the flesh of her breast. It is also impossible to overlook the large protrusion of a goiter painted at the side of the woman's neck, and her unfocused eyes, an effect I take as intentional because of the painter's skill at controlling the direction of other figures' gazes. In the face of this direct depiction of unhealthfulness, we might then reassess the other figures in the scroll and notice how a number of those with adult bodies, dress, and hair are painted the same size as children. We might now read malnourishment into these size discrepancies. In some ways, this painting follows in the tradition of Southern Song academic figure painting that has been associated with Li Song, yet it harnesses formal tensions and thematizes them as not only the structuring principle of the pictorial composition, but also of the embodied viewing experience. The painting's ambiguity arises from the modulation of affective responses orchestrated by its sequential structure. It allows for a humorous reading of the first half, but gradually introduces more signs of suffering and distress that make a comedic interpretation unsustainable. However, it also cannot be read as solely highlighting the hardships of rural life, due to the initial comedic tone and certain details in the second half, such as the flute player and plump goose, that insert joviality into the scene. We are left not knowing how to respond or what to feel, a state of ambiguity that further adds to the list of tensions that the painting both contains and produces. In what way is this painting political? It does not operate as a direct commentary on the conditions of peasants in the mode of paintings of disaster victims, such as when Zheng Xia sent a painting of famine refugees to the Shenzong emperor to protest the policies of Wang Anshi. Nor does it operate like the more veiled, though still unequivocal critiques lodged by paintings such as the Seattle Museum of Art's Buffalo and Herd Boy in the style of Li Tang, or Emaciated Horse by Gong Kai. It seems to occupy an intermediate space between the celebration of rusticity and the pointed depiction of suffering. I characterize this painting as political because it problematizes the pleasure derived from viewing pictures and performs a kind of bait and switch by replacing humor with discomfort. I contend that the hand scroll format contributes to the positioning of pleasure as a subject of scrutiny and to the painting's condition of being difficult, as viewing it requires focused looking and the investment of sustained attention. As viewers, we have the power to control the unfolding of the viewing process through the manipulation of the scroll. We can hungrily consume the details and textures of painted bodies, but our gaze is confronted and our pleasure undermined by the accrual of unsettling figures and the dissipation of compositional order. Whether or not this is a painting of Yang Pu moving his family, it is certainly a painting of rural conditions and is a social site, as it brings into relation people of differing, if still humble, social positions and economic means. In taking into account the effect of the hand scroll format and sequential looking, I have endeavored to complicate the placement of this painting within the categories of either humor or, alternatively, of strict decrial of hardship. The painting exists partially in both these categories, but also in neither. It holds an intermediary position that is produced by the interplay of tensions within the painting and between the painting and the viewer, who is implicated as an onlooker participant and whose control over their encounter with the pictorial image is compromised. Thank you very much.
Great. Please, the speakers come to the podium to answer questions. So we have about 5 minutes, right?
25.
25 minutes. Okay. We have plenty, 25 minutes to answer questions. Yes, please.
So thank you so much to all the panelists. This was really a stimulating set of talks, and I really enjoyed hearing all of you. Olivia, I have a question for you. I was really interested in the way that you were analyzing your hand scroll, and I thought it was actually like it was a really interesting way of sort of like looking at that particular work. And I was really sort of taken with the way that you were like making connections between the way figures were depicted in the scroll and, you know, looking at other depictions in other paintings. And when I was looking at your breastfeeding woman on the back of the water buffalo, you know, the fact that she had a goiter and her appearance, which was actually very malnourished, and also the child also looked very malnourished, I immediately thought of the Joe Chun Beggars and Street Characters figure in the Cleveland Museum of Art, I believe it is. There's, you know, I'm sure that you know that scroll, but you know, obviously it depicts, you know, lots of very unfortunate, downtrodden people. But one of them, of course, is a woman who's standing up, breastfeeding with her chest exposed and with a goiter, and you know, a really horrible expression on her face, and she looks, you know, completely ill, and her child looks very, very malnourished as well. Do you see a connection between those two figures, and can you talk a little bit maybe about that connection?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? No. Yes? Yeah, okay.
Can we have the painting put back up on the screen?
I don't know how, but,
That would be for Gus.
okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. That would have been a great comparison for me to bring in. I wish I had done that. But I thank you for bringing that up as well, because something that I found very interesting about this particular painting was that it was hard for me to place it kind of fully in one category or another of kind of what is the message or what is the affect produced. Is it a scroll like that is really showing suffering and malnourishment kind of in a very holistic way, versus this where there are kind of these, to me, conflicting elements. And that's something I was trying to grapple with in my paper, was how to interpret these conflicting messages I was getting from looking at it. So I think there are connections, but I also think that something complicated about this scroll is that kind of ambiguity.
Thank you.
Okay, one question there.
Sorry, I think the microphone's coming to me. I really like the analysis of the structure of the painting. I think you can even go even further in that direction. The ox is incredibly fat.
Yeah.
Terrific. We've got the painting back. That is one healthy ox.
Yes. Yes.
So I think there is so much tension in this painting. It's almost excruciating to look at it too long, because there's poverty, there's distress, there's humor, there's anxiety, and for the woman this emaciated child to be on the back of such a plump ox, clearly we are being asked to think about that. The original? What's the date of the original? This guy having to go to office.
Yang Pu, that's like late 10th century.
Late 10th century. And the dating of this painting, we don't.
Right.
Was it vaguely Yuan? Or
vaguely early Yuan. Yes.
Vaguely early Yuan. I'm not going to say anything more about that. You can figure it out. But I think that central figure staring out at us, in fact, you've got you've shown us the ovals, but there's two grand ovals, I think, left and right. And we're being, and everyone in the left hand of the painting is worrying about what's happening in the right hand of the painting. So not everybody's looking back, but the flow of the river is against them. Everything's pushing you back to the right hand side of the painting. So what you've done is terrific. Keep doing more of it, I guess, is all I want to say.
Okay, Okay, thank you. If I could just say one thing in relation to that, something I didn't talk specifically about, but that I think is interesting with this idea you're bringing up, that everything is kind of pushing you back to the beginning, is the way this painting moves the eye versus how one would be moving their hand or their body in viewing the scroll. And I think that these don't necessarily align throughout the reading of the scroll. So that's another, I think, element that comes up in relation to that pushing back to the beginning. Yeah, thank you.
Professor Wong, one there.
Hello.
Professor Wu
Yes.
Wong
Hi.
there,
I
and
have
then Liu Bo is next.
I have some point, and the first for Olivia. It's a wonderful paper, a very detailed, beautiful, sensitive reading of the painting. I know that painting pretty well, and so you really offer very interesting reading structurally and about the gaze, about the interaction between the viewer and the figures in the painting. I have two sort of questions. Can we go back to the painting? The first is a very important feature of the painting. I think you implied, but you never really bring it out, is the role of water. Because the water plays such a prominent role there. And makes this painting really unique, because I haven't seen any painting like that. People really walking in the water, basically bare leg, and including this called Yang pool. It's not just a pool, the lower part of his torso is totally bare. His legs, you never see an official scholar portrayed that way. And almost this 2/3 of the painting, the people all walking in the water. So what is the significance of the water in this painting, and why the painter situates these figures in such a situation? And also there's a detail just at the upper left corner. There's water pouring in from above. That is not a waterfall we see in this kind of generic landscape painting. I have a lot of waterfall. So that kind of looks like a waterfall, but actually if we connect it with this kind of water, the major body of the water, maybe again, what the significance of that little stream pouring in from that very strategic position at the ending of the painting. So that's my first question about water. And how do you add these very obvious elements into your reading of the overall painting? The second is actually because yesterday we heard these papers about beauties from exactly the same period, like Sun Song or maybe early Yuan, that period. So how do you situate these kind of portrayal of female figure in that kinds of context? Can you call it like anti-beauty, is ugliness, poverty? And you show some other example. Actually, there are another painting in Beijing's Palace Museum showing an equally grotesque woman weaving. I think Rosalind, you know that painting very well. Is again the poverty and the very ugliness of figure. So between the two group of images, one is this kind of 仕女化 beauty, and another is this kind of really poor and so how do we contextualize these two kind of images? So that's my later I have some questions for other speakers, maybe.
Great, thank you so much. Those are two wonderful questions that I don't think I can fully answer, but I think cause for a lot of thinking that I need to do. But I think in terms of the water, so of course there's the idea that it might be a flood with the water trickling in or pouring in, kind of depending on how you read that fall of water in the upper corner. And I think that's I kind of just evade that issue in my presentation. But I think at the same time, the idea that these are people fleeing a flood, some sort of disaster, is not fully played out in the figures themselves, with kind of the children stripping down to kind of joyfully enter the water, it seems, and the flute player with the leading this procession. So I think there are elements that cause me to question, is this fleeing some sort of flood? But I do think that the predominance of water is notable, because it fills up most of the composition. I also have the question of if this is the full painting. I think that could very well be perhaps that this is not the complete scroll. And of course, it has no colophons or inscriptions. So I think it has likely been removed from its context in that sense. So I think that could also perhaps, with what might be missing, might help explain some of these, what I find to be kind of puzzling features, but perhaps not. And then in terms of the relating this to Shernyu or Mei Ren Hua, yes, I think it's a very different portrayal of women. Certainly not striving to present someone as beautiful, but I think there's also, because I've spent so much time looking at this painting now, and my initial reactions were somewhat disgust, or it's somewhat difficult to look at. But over time, I became very, very fond of this woman on the ox, and I find her very powerful. She's malnourished, but she's also she's not holding on in any way, just with the strength of her legs, and as she's so large. So I think, right, it's purposefully presenting her in a somewhat malnourished, I hesitate to say negative, but it's not healthy portrayal, but I also don't think it's fully presenting her as someone despicable. So that's something for me to think about more. Thank you.
I totally agree. It's a very powerful, sympathetic figure when you look at her very long enough. So here, actually, maybe you can explore a little bit about psychological depth, because in association with that kind of figure, Song painters begin to explore people's emotion and the kind of inner state. Very different from this so-called Shernyu Hua. It's a lot of this surface, and rarely really show this the state of mind. But this woman, you see the face, you see expression, you see mood. Suffering is not just from clothes; it's from her face as well. I have a question. It's a question for Rosalind. Again, wonderful paper guiding us through this wonderful painting. My question is very simple. Just the first two sentences of Wang Meng's Inscription, that poem, I find a very interesting shift from this reading to farming. Like putting a kind of more like a sequential chronological order. Like in the past, this place was associated with reading. I came here, or he came here to read. And now, he or I came here to watch or to farm. So that is the 旧, the old days, and Qin and myself today. So this temporal shift, put in that political context or whatever yuan. So I want to know a little bit about this meaning of this shift from reading to farming. Because we normally associate with hermitage, whatever, with both maybe. Seems, but here I find a little bit tension between reading. It seems the hero, the protagonist in the painting, somehow the reading was the past association with the landscape, with this mountain. But today it's more about like agriculture, or farming, or planning, or it's a rural activity. I don't know if first this kind of reading is valid, and secondly, if there's indeed this shift from past, present, reading, farming, what that mean?
Thank you very much. At any rate, thank you very much for that observation. I have thought about it, and at times I've even tried to sort of think about maybe perhaps it was a reference to sort of emphasize the oldness of the books that he was reading, to sort of give them a sense of antiquity or something like that as well. I don't know that I have much to say about how that would fit in politically, because I think that perhaps it's more about sort of an idea of a vision of what I used to do, and in the hopes that I had, perhaps, the aspirations I have. And here I find myself in the 1360s, which is a very difficult time, as Timothy Brooke has documented with issues of flooding and drought and what have you. So I guess I don't have a clear answer, but to say I should think about it, I guess it's probably a sense of disappointment I feel. You know, now I'm personally plowing. But on the other hand, there's a sense of pride about personally plowing. And so I think it's about, you know, taking that farmer that is referred to in the classics, the Zulu, and identifying with him and being proud of that heritage. So I'm not really, I mean, I guess that's what I would say. But yes, I could just.
Just a follow-up. Probably can support your general argument if you're reading the book, associated book, reading book, with more like a official career or
Yes.
social norms.
Correct.
So the farming more like a pioneer or this type of.
Correct, yes. That would parallel.
So the book is not just about personal pleasure, but also about the career, for exam, for the more social space.
And it also,
That shift may imply that kind of association with the core society or with
thank you, that's great. And I also think that reading the books and the classics allows him to have this understanding of the value of farming, and specifically the Chingan. So again, that's really great. I think that would be something to further emphasize. Thank you.
Liu Bo first.
Okay, I have a few questions. First one for Gray. I liked how you read the little characters on Li Xiong's fan painting, Knick-Knack Peddler. I wonder what's your understanding about the quote-unquote mistakes, like the two verses from the Tang Dynasty? So my sense is, do you think it's intentional to show that the fan was supposed to be sold to the villagers and who was not well educated, and then when a viewer look at the fans like those, they would be kind of amused. That's a question for Gray. And then for Olivia, thank you for introducing this wonderful picture to us. Actually, I have a few questions. One is the issue of human nakedness, which kind of shocked me, because we don't really see a lot of images with topless figures. I also noticed one figure toward the end of the section, even his bottom is fully revealed. And when I teach out of China, I taught my students the painting by the Jesuit artist Giuseppe Castiglione. He painted a long hand scroll called 100 Steed. In his preparatory drawing of a groom who is in the water, he drew a painting of the back of the groom who has muscles in the picture. But then in his final paintings, he fully covered that groom. So for this painting, I'm kind of surprised. We see so many topless figures, although they were supposed to be boys, but they don't really look like boys, right? Mm-hmm. So that's my comment or question maybe. And second comment is how do we read the farmers or village people in Song and Yuan painting? And the women in the last section do have, she looks poor, right? She's old and she's all wrinkled and she has health issues, but she's still smiling, right? And so she has some sort of power, and she's also nurturing a boy, so she is giving life to someone else. And so here we can kind of see the juxtaposition of like a poor, rich woman, but then also she is presented as something like positive. And also at the beginning of this painting, we see this kind of a happy atmosphere, right? A friend and young kid looking out from behind a tree. Well, this reminds me of the painting Professor Wu Hong also mentioned, the one from Palace Museum in Beijing, attributed to Wang Juzheng, called Spinning Wheel, right? Well, that painting also has like a malnourished old woman, but she doesn't, although her physical, is in poor physical shape, but she's still working, and she also has this kind of smiley face. And then at the beginning of that painting, we see a young boy who is playing with a toad. So here again, we see it's kind of a combining or a mixture of humor and then like poor lady, but not really poor, right? Physically she's poor, but she still have some power, right? And also the issue of maybe a like footnote. Also the woman breastfeeding. Well, in my memory, I see in addition to Li Song's Knick-Knack Peddler, which shows a woman, country woman breastfeeding a little baby, in the Spinning Wheel by Wang Juzheng, in the center of the painting, there is also a woman breastfeeding, a younger woman breastfeeding. Well, but in these two paintings, we don't really see the woman's breast. While in the painting that you talked about today, also we see a clear image of the breast, wrinkly breast, right? So like the issue of nakedness, this painting is also kind of unusual. Okay, so that's my comment and questions.
Thank you so much for your question. That's mainly the Li Song one with the 2 strips of characters attached to the that was research finding by Qin Man and Huang Xiaofeng. And also in their research, they found that in these different versions of the Knick-Knack Peddler, they had the 2 strips of characters attached to, but they are not exact same characters, but in sound they are the same. So that meant that farmers or villagers, they not necessarily could read the characters, but the kind of the poem reference here may be circulating at the time, so that they were familiar with how it was read. So when it was read, they know that it's the saying of it. So they didn't really need to know how the characters were written. Yeah, and so it's not a mistake. It's actually Li Song deliberately wrote things that reading from surface is nonsense, but in sound, it's the poem alluded to or referenced to Feng Dao's poem. Yeah.
But the viewers of that fan
Right. The viewers,
they were not villagers. They were
right.
presumably well-educated people,
so in that case, the viewers in Hangzhou, because Li Song was a native of Hangzhou, and this painting was made in court at the beginning, and then may be spread to the market. So the viewers may be able to get the message that the couplets were referring to the poem. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Those were 3 brilliant papers, so thank you each. Really stimulating and lots to talk about. I also want to go to Olivia. I think that when we look at that woman, she's aged but not old. I think that would be more appropriate way to discuss her, because she has a young baby, but her health issues have aged her. So that would be, I think, helpful to look. But I was struck by the way you described it. At one point, you talked about cohesion and order of the figures despite this tension, and which led me to think about this as a reading of Confucianism. Overall thoughts of this is a commentary on how to bring society under order and harmony in a Confucian viewpoint, but also, as Tim Brooke pointed out, that big fat water buffalo, which brings in a Taoist reading. And so overall, might it be possible to read this scroll as a tension between how to live a life? Do you choose a Confucian philosophy to or a Taoist philosophy to help yourself in difficult circumstances. But then looking at it as well, I was struck by the images of the tugging of the cauldron and other things, and the mostly naked attendant figures, and the figure sitting on the water buffalo. And it brought me right up to what else? Wu Bin and the 500 Lohan scroll, where you have a very similar situation, although of course different, but it just struck me that that painting, I was just wondering about the circulation of this painting since the time of painting and up through the late Ming, because the difficult, somewhat, I won't call them ugly, but the figures that are not beautiful, but are difficult to look at, strike me as perhaps inspiration for somebody like a Ding Yunpeng painting some of his very difficult to look at Lohan figures and the Wu Bin Lohan, so that there's a Buddhist sort of resolve in the 17th century, but these three teachings in tension with each other, if not in conflict, just struck me as a potential way of reading this really fascinating scroll. So I'd like your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and also to Dr. Liu for your comments as well. This is a lot to think about. Yeah, so I think where I kind of went with my paper so far was to try to think through what is the affective response that I'm having, and how is the painting producing that? But I didn't really get into why questions, and I think that that's what's kind of coming up here at different ways to take this further. And so I really, I don't know that I have many comments to respond now, but I really appreciate these insights for food for thought. Thank you.
One question there.
Thanks very much. No, they were marvelous papers, all of them. And I was struck by the resonance between Rosalind's and Olivia's, because they draw out the importance of, looking at somebody else doing something with effort. And there is some, and I was struck by the fact that, in my thinking of from a European perspective, I don't know of a painting in Europe like Olivia's, which has all these people with whom you're compelled to empathize. There are so many people who are exerting effort in different ways, including the lady on top of the buffalo, and it's not an easy thing. And I did wonder whether I wouldn't see the painting's communication really being so much about, sort of emotional affect, but it's more about motor, sensory motor response. It's the sense of the difficulty of things, how you move through water, which is probably moving itself. I've never been so engaged looking at a painting and feeling an identification with the figures. And then I felt that maybe because it's all about, in a sense, it's all about physical activity, it's all about labor in a sense, that what you see at the left-hand end with the flute player and the waterfall resolves everything and says actually everything's easy. Everything can be easy. So it's the tensions involved, the thing don't. And I would also think that, and again, I have no idea whether it may be true, but the process of sort of looking at a scroll, which involves physical engagement with it, and there is your body is already alive when you're looking at a scroll in a way that it isn't if you're looking at the Sistine Chapel or a Raphael Madonna or something like that. There is, and I wondered whether, because you're unrolling this scroll, this sense that it could be about activity, physical activity and labor, and its resolution would be more possible meaning than it would be in another context.
Yes, thank you. I do think that the format has something to do with the difficulty of the painting. Difficulty could be taken in different ways, so perhaps the difficulty of the figures is kind of being ambiguous, but also, as you're pointing to, the investment of labor or energy in viewing the painting, viewing a hand scroll. And this one is not very long compared to some hand scrolls, but it still requires an intimate engagement, a sustained attention, as well as physical manipulation. And so I do think that that has something to do with this sensory response that you're pointing to. Yes, so thank you for that comment. It's very thought-provoking.
Great. I think we.
I have one quick question also for Olivia. It's a great painting. I kind of find myself really annoyed at Yang Pu, though. I mean, because in some ways, here he is, he's there doing his act, he's got his hat on, but then the woman who's associated with him is really miserable. And I think that in some ways, I'm wondering about possibly the condition that he's put in, or he's put everyone in, and then you can sort of think and extrapolate, why is it that he is resisting going to the court when presumably it would help finance things, yet he's got all these children, how did that happen? And then this poor woman who's, just crouched on the buffalo looking quite miserable. I just sort of thought it might be a larger commentary about the role of the scholar, official, or the idea of the the independence, and where does that lead one? So I would just question how sympathetic a character, or how sympathetic is Yang Pu, and maybe he is, and that's not bad, but he really isn't put people in a difficult situation.
Right, and I think that that's interesting because in the kind of how figures self-position themselves as that kind of independent, free spirit, I can think of Li Yu talking about, so much later, but about, for example, the rhetoric of not spending your money on food for your family so that you can buy paintings or so that you can do different things to be a free spirit. So I think that there's something to that, kind of the jeopardizing one's family responsibilities in order to pursue. Yes, so thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, we can continue the discussion during the coffee break.